Hello there, thank you for staying with us and welcome to another edition of Channels Beam. I'm Victor Matthias. Now, following President Muhammadu Buhari's signing of the 2022 appropriation bill into law, there have been debates as to how the country intends to fund the budget as well as the impact expected via its implementation. Now, while some believe the budget is not realistic, others believe the government have put in place proper measures to ensure its funding and implementation. On this edition of the show, we will be looking at the breakdown of the budget, how realistic its funding will be, given it is the highest since the president took office, and also what the impact areas will be as it is implemented. And joining us to look at this, we have with us Hamzat Lawal. He is the CEO and founder of Follow the Money, as well as a global Malala Fund education champion working to accelerate girls' education in Northeast Nigeria. We also have Atiku Samuel Oluwatobi. He is a development economist and public finance management expert who has authored papers that cover various development subjects, including domestic resource mobilization, public debt sustainability, and budget credibility. He joins us via Skype from Abuja. I beg your pardon, via Zoom from Abuja. It's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me on the program.
Of course, indeed. So, I mean, let's start with the breakdown of the budget. What were your thoughts when it eventually came out at the beginning?
I think when the budget came out, I think the first thing that will come to mind is the size of the budget. Essentially, you want to look at how big the budget is compared to the revenue. You want to actually measure whether the budget, of course, when you have a budget and then you can't implement the budget, that raises a big question. Of course, that would be the second thing that comes to mind. How credible is the budget, the numbers? Then the third aspect is about the impact of the budget on the people. Will this budget actually have improved health outcome? Will it improve education outcome? Will it increase employment for the steaming numbers of unemployed youth? Of course, will it actually have direct impact on the insecurity issues that everybody seems to have been talking about? What will be the potential? So certainly you want a budget that will actually fix virtually all societal problems in Nigeria. So I think that's clearly what comes to mind when I saw the budget for this year.
So in terms of all of the things you listed, how realistic are all of these going to be in the budget?
Well, if we look at trajectory of what has happened in the past, in 2020, I think the entire expenditure plan, the total spending was about 10 trillion. Last year, we're looking at something about 14 trillion. So 17 trillion is not too far away. But again, when you look at the fiscal structure of things, then it becomes a little bit questionable. Looking at budget performance for last year, for instance, the total revenue of the federal government for last year could actually barely just service debt. So that raises a lot of sustainability question. Why we're spending big, but the truth is that the biggest core where we're getting the funding to of course, we're spending 14 trillion and on the back of about 5-6 trillion naira revenue. There are question marks about why we are borrowing heavily to fund some of the programs we seem to be implementing. But notwithstanding that, I think overall, I will say, and I've always said this, that the truth is that if we can actually rain down on some excesses, especially around our expenditure, and direct funds to things that are actually more tangible, then definitely we'll see improvement in the country. Now, this year's budget had a mix of both. We have some interesting things. Of course, I can highlight some of those things. One, basic healthcare provision fund. Of course, we have about 57 trillion going into, about 57 billion going into that.
I was going to ask how much the budget is.
Yeah, it's about 50. I think I did not get your question.
Oh, no. When you said 57 trillion, I was going to say, how much is the budget?
No. I mean 57 billion going into the basic fund. And then we can see the impact of that fund in most of the primary healthcare centers around us. We look at the UBEC itself, Universal Basic Education Fund, and we can see the impact, at least to a particular degree in the last 3 years, on, I'll call it on some of the primary healthcare. I say primary healthcare, some of the primary schools around the country. So we could look at that tiny bit of the budget and say, okay, there could actually be potential impact. But when you look at the big picture itself, One of the big picture I highlighted earlier, spending heavily on debt servicing. The second one is what you call non-regular allowance, going to politicians and government officials, traveling around. Of course, when you have almost 1 trillion dedicated to that, then that raises a big question. So I would say it's a mixed bag of both. On one side, there are programs that actually impact the people in the budget. On the other side, you have huge funds that are questionable. I mean, if you are borrowing funds to actually pay estaco for government officials to travel abroad, that raises a whole lot of questions. So how do we mix the two together? I think that's where the debate comes in. And I think that's what have been the topical issue that people seem to be talking about.
All right, just hold it for a second. I'll come back to you in a minute. But let me move over to you, Hamzat, again. You are a IFAIR honorary ambassador. That's an initiative of the State of Israel and the Office of the Vice President of Nigeria, as well as an advisory board member of Beyonce Global Citizen Fellowship. Thanks again for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having
me. Samuel Atiku has, given us pretty much, an overview, of what, he thinks this budget is going to look like. Thankfully, we're in 2022 already. But, in your own estimation, what do you think, especially in terms of it being realistic and its implementation, as you've been following the money over the years?
When we piggyback on the past 4 budget cycle and this current budget, one, there's a crisis. There's a fiscal crisis. There's also a revenue crisis. And when you look at it honestly, and knowing that we're now going into a campaign electioneering season, 2022 budget is a campaign budget. It's a budget for politics and electioneering. And I say this without any fear or favor. And this year, citizens should work closely. There will be a lot of intervention. There will be a lot of money in circulation. And you see a lot of programs, by government just to induce voters and show that,
So what kind of programs? Are you talking about developmental programs or?
Again, no. More like you see more programs around conditional cash payment. You see more programs around, the one that the Ministry of Labor,
But these are programs that are implemented to benefit the people.
But how do you measure the impact of these programs? Today, we've seen where government have said, oh, we're now going to the 4th phase of employing people and paying them 30,000 naira a month. But then when you look at what has been the impact, and we're talking about billions of naira, and mind you, when you look at the social investment program, particularly the conditional cash transfer, I call it conditional cash payment, by the way, because if you're transferring funds, it should move from one account, and since government says they're working on single treasury account, so why is it not moving, from the single treasury account to citizens' accounts? And when you also look at policies around cashless economy, integrating people into the financial system, why are you putting heaps of naira notes on the table and counting 5,000 and giving poor people? So when I look at the budget, I just shake my head because we're dealing with a fiscal crisis and we're not realistic. It's not about saying, oh, we have over 7 trillion naira budget. Mind you, the National Assembly also imputed in the budget and increased it. President Muhammad Buhari submitted over 16 trillion naira and he signed over 17 trillion. So about 700 billion naira was imputed, by members of the National Assembly. And let me tell you the implication. First, the president rejected the electoral amendment bill. There was a provision to ensure direct primary. So what this also means is it would help take away money politics. But the fact that he did not sign it, so we're going to go back to indirect primary, or probably the bill will say may. So you have to either select as a political party direct or indirect primary. So what this means is if political parties goes with the way of indirect primaries, it means money would play the order of the day. So you have to buy your way through public office. So you have to pay delegates, to vote for you to become candidates.
What if he eventually signs the bill?
Well, we all know that he declined. So it means that if he signs, now the National Assembly is going to work on a bill that probably would say would give political party the right to decide if they want to go by direct primaries or indirect primaries. But we all know that there was the heat of the moment was the fact that a lot of governors do not want direct primaries, which would have taken powers back to the people, at the grassroots particularly. So again, the budget, the budget itself would talk to more of politics. So this year, let's watch closely. Probably I'm wrong, but time will tell as we go into the campaign season.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the key things that played a role is the Finance Act also, which also came. What was your reaction to that?
It's exciting. It's exciting that we have a policy and regulatory framework. But then my own challenge is, when you look at the budgets, when you look at the Finance Act, we're going to be servicing debts with over 3 trillion. So it means servicing debt, not even paying the debt. So you were servicing over 3 trillion. And the government also have plans to go and borrow. And, like Atiku has said, what are we borrowing? What are we using these borrowed funds to do? When you look at our overhead is killing us. And again, we're still subsidizing fuel. Are we subsidizing for poor people? And when you look at data, the highest consumption of petroleum pump is Lagos, Kano, Port Harcourt. These are border states. So, and when you look at our borders, so, when you look at the countries around our borders, on an average, it's around 300 to 370 for petroleum pump price. But it's only in Nigeria we pay 145 naira or thereabouts. So are we truly subsidizing for the poor people, or we're subsidizing for smugglers to come and take our petroleum pump price, smuggle them out of our shores? So when you look at the budget, does the budget speak to subsidy, or the Minister of Finance said, if subsidy is fully removed, they're going to give poor people 5,000. Again, we need to consider what is the cost of transportation rather than what is the cost of petroleum pump price. Because again, when you aggregate data, people are paying more for transportation rather than actually how much we buy fuel, because we're actually not subsidizing for poor people.
All right, I'll come back to you again. Now, let me go back again to Zoom, where we have Lloyd Atiku. Lloyd, so let's look at the allocations now to critical sectors, especially. Which of the sectors would you say, had the most allocations, and what is the impact we'll be getting from these allocations?
Yes, if you look at the budget and then you critically want to dissect it, I think the budget historically had been, of course, tilting towards the defense and security sector. This year, about 13.4. I'm talking about sectoral allocation now. Notwithstanding that, it's important for me to quickly mention that the amount of money that Nigeria will spend servicing its debt this year actually is bigger than how much we will spend on defense and security, which is actually an aberration. It's strange in many sense. I mean, the budget for security and defense is about 2.29 trillion. If you combine the two together, that's the projection for 2022, compared to about 5 trillion that will be going to debt servicing. Essentially, we're spending almost 2.5 on servicing debt than we are on defense. But in terms of social sector, we're looking at education, health. Education is about 1.2 trillion. And when I say 1.2 trillion, I'm not talking about the MDA itself. I'm talking about the entire budget for education, everything combined, broken down into the Federal Ministry of Education, about 815, which is huge. And then you have Universal Basic Education Commission, I think about 112 billion, and then about 206 billion that will be going under the tech fund for universities, at least for research activity. That's huge, but just to quickly mention that the National Assembly did slash that budget down by almost 100 billion. We would have done better if some 100 billion had been dedicated to that sector. In the health sector, I mean, the allocation is still, again, very small, 5.1% of the budget itself is going to health. Remember, the projection is that we should be doing at least close to 15%, meaning that we are actually underallocating to that sector by a phantom of almost about how many percent now? We are doing just 1/3 of what we should be doing for that sector. But that said, I think it's important to again to quickly mention that the Gavi, if you notice Nigeria, one of the biggest problem in the health sector in the country is the fact that a lot of people, a lot of children, especially under 5, actually died needlessly because they can't get access to basic immunization, right? Things like normal routine immunization against basic disease, things that have been done. So many countries have actually gone past that pool, at least in the 70s. This year, the budget is about 49.3 billion budgeted for that sector under the Gavi initiative. The truth is that government needs to be doing close to 100 billion in that sector, and that raises some big questions. Why are we under budgeting, under allocating resources to critical sector like this when about 1 trillion will be going for non-regular allowance. Non-regular allowance means that people traveling abroad, extra food and all those kind of things. And why can't we put some of these resources into this critical sector? And I can go on and on and on. If you look closely again at another sector, which is the key infrastructure sector, 1.42 trillion is going for key infrastructure spending this year, which is about 8.3% of the budget. If you look at the National Development Plan, we should be doing more than this. At least we should be doing close to about 7 trillion in this sector. So that raises a big question. If you have a 17 trillion naira budget, and then you are putting only 1.4 trillion on infrastructure, and then defense is taking about 2.3 trillion, and then the other social sector is taking less than 2 trillion. The question is that where are we actually directing funds at? What are we directing funds at? And that brings to question why government needs to take this serious and rejig the entire budget system. And that's what we've been advocating, just like Amzat has rightfully said, that some of these funds, at least we can better direct it into other sectors.
All right, let me just hold you there for a bit. We will take a quick break, and of course, when we come back, we'll still continue some of these things that is expected of the budget this year. Please stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. We still have with us Hamzat Lawan right here in our Lagos studio, as well as Lloyd Atiku, who is joining us via Skype. So, Lloyd, as we wind down this conversation now, one of the things the Minister of Finance talked about is the room that they're giving citizens to be part of, monitoring the budget and also maybe perhaps its implementation. So the iMonitor, as well as an app, it's called the Citizens Budget Monitoring app. How far do you think this will go in helping the government, to be on its toes in terms of, doing what they said they will do with this budget?
Yes, I think the first pillar, any budgetary system, one, actually involves citizens. Take feedback from citizens. And when you take feedback from citizens, that a lot of problems will be addressed. And so I have always been an advocate of having effective public participatory system, especially within the military system. Meaning that in a rural community, in my village, somewhere there in Ogun State, community development association or community members from that local government can actually give meaningful feedback directly to the federal government on what is happening in their community with respect to government projects. And the truth is that the biggest level of corruption that happens in this country, and I'm sure that will testify to that happens in this country are those tiny projects that government cannot monitor. It's very difficult to monitor. I mean, just for context, in the budget for this year, we are dealing with over 20,000 projects of government. So how do you track 20,000 projects that's actually spread across all communities in the country? So the truth is that without a meaningful participatory framework, a public participatory framework for taking feedback from citizens, definitely there will be problems along the process itself. So one thing I will say quickly is that I think that's a positive one, and I'm sure, of course, we've not seen how those feedbacks have been used, but notwithstanding that, you will notice that if you look closely at the budget, some salient issues that were raised in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 had been, at least to a particular degree, had been addressed, and it essentially shows clearly that at least to a particular degree, information are actually filtering from community directly to government. On the flip side is that how you need to show people how their feedback has been used. And what the framework, especially if you look closely at this framework, the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency framework, the IMF framework, is that anytime you have a public participatory framework like that, systems like that, government must give citizen feedback on how their feedback have been used. Essentially, if somebody like me, Atiku Samuel, send a letter about a problem in my community to the budget office or to a ministry, I should be able to hear back from them on how that feedback has been used. I think that's just the missing link in Nigeria today. The moment we can close that loop, it becomes a two-way communication. The truth is that I think we begin to see improvement, at least trust will now be rebuilt with communities, with citizens, and then with that, we can now have a more robust conversation around this budget. So as it stays today, it's a one-way communication. Government tells citizens what they want, and to a particular degree, why citizens tell government what they themselves want, but we have not seen where government tells citizens, okay, this is what you want, this is why we did not do it, or this is why we have taken up this initiative. I think that's just the missing link in all of this conversation.
All right, let's hope that that link, that gap will be filled, that bridge, will be built to ensure that that communication becomes a two-way communication, like you said. But let me hold you there again. Hamza, let me get your thoughts on the same, issue as well. That's communication between, the citizens and the government. And also, for CSOs like you who actually follow the money, go to all of these places to ensure, what has been the impact, especially for you who can, as an organization, request the FOI, do your due diligence, go and search. What has been that correspondence between, CSOs who track the budgets, and the budget office?
Well, it's exciting that the Ministry of Finance have an app which citizens can use to give feedback. But I also think there's an opportunity here for civil society to scale on this, because not every citizen have access to smartphones. And for those who have access to smartphones, some cannot afford expensive data. So I think for budget monitoring groups and for Follow the Money, it's an opportunity to collect more feedback and help citizens impute it and organize more town hall meetings. I think it's also important that we look at what was the Auditor General's report on previous budget spending and why we're not having public hearings on this Auditor General's report, because you cannot spend and then get audited and you cannot account for how you spent this money. But, by law, it's criminal. I also think that government must adhere to the rule of law. You talked about FOI. We've written hundreds of thousands of FOI, and in most cases, government do not respect and respond to them. Nigeria is a signatory of the Open Government Partnership. So why are government MDAs not responding to FOI? When you look at budget appropriation, you see some budget line that they build in primary schools in a local in a community, or rather in a local government. But then there's no name of a specific community. So for us, we need granular data. You want to track 20,000 projects, you need specific, because there are no two locations anywhere in the world. So if a local government is captured, tell us which ward, which community is the beneficiary, so that one, we can collect feedback, because our budget is no needs assessment. So this is how we as civil society can do needs assessment and give government feedback. And maybe lastly, Victor, we must also understand that this budget cycle, there is no direction. And what do I mean? There's no vision. So if you look at the budget, when you look at appropriation, you can be able to tell what is government priority. So when you look at it, security is not their priority, education is not their priority, healthcare is not their priority, And so you cannot even say, this is what, President Muhammadu Buhari's government using their budgets, which is the Bible and Quran, to show that priority. I'm saying this because we're dealing with 5 pillars of crisis. We're dealing with a humanitarian crisis because of the insecurity. We're dealing with healthcare crisis. Mind you, we're not defeated COVID-19. We're dealing with a social crisis because of the numbers of unemployed young people out there. Now we're dealing with political crisis because of 2023, around the corner. And of course, we know that there's that tension around religion, ethnicity. So if our budget does not talk about security, it doesn't address unemployment, it doesn't address healthcare, education. In the Northeast, for instance, as much as, our gallant soldiers are on that front and keeping us safe and winning the war against the insurgents. It's also important to invest more in insecurity. Today, it might, it will shock a lot of viewers to know that we're still dealing with early child marriage. And numbers of out-of-school children are growing because of the impact of COVID-19 and the impact of lack of funding in the education sector. So what is the vision and direction of our budget if we cannot even take one issue and holistically address it? But mind you, these are all cross-cutting, but it's important that we really fund, this issue so that, we can bounce back better and build back better rather than funding frivolous spending.
Well, let's hope that all of that will be taken care of course, subsequently. But I have to say thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you, Victor, for having me.
I have to say thank you as well to you, Lawyer Atiku, for joining us today on the program and sharing your thoughts on this. Thanks again for joining us via Zoom from Abuja.
Thank you, Victor, for having me. Thank you.
Of course, you're welcome. Well, that's where we are, and that's where we draw the curtain on the show this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Victor Matthias.